We begin tonight with Russia's war on Ukraine, which is continuing 4 years after Moscow launched its full-scale invasion. At the outset, President Putin of Russia apparently thought that the Ukrainian leadership would be overthrown by its own people within 3 days. But 4 years on, the war continues to grind on, with hundreds of thousands of people killed. And Russian strikes on Ukraine have continued. Ukrainian officials say at least 5 people, including a child, were injured and several multi-story buildings were damaged in the latest drone strikes on the city of Zaporizhia. Leaders and politicians from all over Europe are in the capital, Kyiv, to mark the grim milestone. Internationally, efforts are continuing to bring the war to an end, led by the US. And only recently, Donald Trump said that he wanted a solution by June. Correspondents say there is not yet the prospect of a ceasefire, even though there's going to be another round of negotiations due to take place in Geneva in just a couple of days' time. The Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, has been addressing the nation.
Putin не досягнув своїх цілей.
Putin has not achieved his goals. He has not broken Ukrainians. He has not won this war. We have preserved Ukraine, and we will do everything to secure peace and justice.
Справедливість. Сьогодні рівно 4 роки.
Today marks exactly 4 years since Putin started his 3-day push to take Kyiv, and that, in fact, says a great deal about our resistance, about how Ukraine has fought all this time. Behind those words stand millions of our people. Behind those words stand immense courage, incredibly hard work, endurance, and the long path Ukraine has been pursuing since February 24th.
Meanwhile, Western leaders have been praising Ukraine's courage and resistance on the 4th anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion. The British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, hailed what he called Ukraine's incredible resilience. Mr. Starmer said the UK would continue to push for peace. President Macron of France described Russia's attack as a military, economic and strategic failure. There's no senior official visiting from the US. President Zelenskyy urged his allies to maintain their support, describing the war as an attack by a sick state on a sovereign one. For its part, Russia says it hasn't yet achieved its war aims, and the West's support for Ukraine meant it had become a much wider confrontation.
Since the beginning of the war, the European Union has provided nearly 200 billion euros in military and financial support. More than any other partner, and there is more to come. And let me spell out 3 ways of support, how our support will be maintained and how it will be reinforced. The first one is the European Union loan of 90 billion euro. We call it the steel porcupine loan because it should give Ukraine the strength of a steel porcupine, indigestible for potential invaders. Let me be crystal clear, and the President of the Council also said it. The loan was agreed by 27 heads of state and government in the European Council. They have given their word. This word cannot be broken. So we will deliver on the loan, one way or the other. Let me be very clear, we have different options and we will use them.
President of the European Commission there, Ursula von der Leyen. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now on the line from London by the author and international affairs analyst, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Laskiewicz. How would you assess the toll that this war has taken in the last 4 years on both Ukraine and Russia?
Well, like every war, it's costing human lives, injuries, human mental health as well should not be forgotten. And also in terms of material damage to buildings, infrastructure. And of course, it also uses up a great deal of resources because you have to maintain armies in the field and supply them munitions, food, and so on. So it has been an economic cost to both sides, a human cost in terms of lives. And so from that point of view, the war, like every war, is of course debatable whether it should have been fought for that reasons.
the war start 4 years ago or 12 years ago? Because the Ukrainians insist they've been resisting the Russians for that long.
Now, that is far more debatable. Certainly, we can start with the 4 years. That's quite clear. There was an invasion by Russia. We can also point out that Russia took a piece of Ukrainian territory before. As for the resistance, it's not clear what they mean by that. There is another view of the resistance against the Russian separatists, namely that the Russian separatists don't want to be ruled by Ukraine. So why precisely refusing a secession by Russian separatists is a resistance is not so easy an argument. But certainly in the sense that some Ukrainian territory, namely Crimea, was taken by Russia, please note that there was no resistance in that sense. This is not the case. What is the case is that legally speaking, Ukraine has never accepted the loss of any of its territory. So from that point of view, a legal point of view, certainly Ukraine has resisted for 12 years.
And just looking at the lay of the land at the moment, if I might put it that way, would it be fair to say that without the Americans, there is no way Ukraine can advance in this war, irrespective of what the Europeans do?
Unfortunately, the Europeans simply aren't in the same league as the Americans. And therefore, it's not much a question of Ukraine advancing as Ukraine continuing to resist. Here, the Americans still have a key role to play. Elon Musk switched off Starlight for the Russians, and that immediately made any sort of Russian advance far more difficult, if possible. And so actually, behind the scenes, behind all the talk of European leaders, it's still the Americans which have the control. If they decide to give Starlight back to the Russians, then suddenly we could see a different point of view altogether. Moreover, it has to be pointed out that the Russians are fighting with one hand held behind their backs because they're not using their nuclear weapons. And so from that point of view, what is likely to happen is that America is unlikely to switch back Starlight, and therefore Ukraine will continue to hold out, but not necessarily recover any of its territory.
So what are your thoughts on this 4th anniversary about, in particular, when this Russia-Ukraine conflict might come to an end, and on what kind of conditions and terms?
First and foremost, the fact the war has lasted so long has in its way been a blessing, because Russia almost certainly wishes to expand further. And so being halted in Ukraine has turned out to be very good in that sense for the world. Of course, at a cost for Ukraine in terms of lives and money, and for the West in terms of money. However, it has to be pointed out there's no immediate end to the war in sight, because as President Putin said, Russia has not achieved its war aims, and nor, of course, has Ukraine in the sense of recovering all that territory. And so there's no immediate ceasefire in sight. And it is hard to see just what could bring about a ceasefire. It is very hard to see how Russia can be pressurized easily. What could happen is that as the West delivers better arms than it is at present, enabling Ukraine to strike more Russian targets, that then Russia might consider halting the war. But you could equally make out a case to say that Russia might decide to scale up the war and go to non-conventional weapons. Either way, it is unlikely the war will stop soon, and July or June, or as was, of course, President Trump's target, is unlikely to, in fact, to be achievable as things stand.
Well, of course, there are ongoing talks to try to end this war. I mean, as you assess them, what's the best case scenario that you see in terms of a possible deal?
Well, first and foremost, the fact that talking at all is very important. That is President Donald Trump's, if you like, success. And it's a very important success. It's only thanks to him they're prepared to talk at all. Unfortunately, they've very little to talk about. They have quite different diametric goals. And short of some major catastrophe, either one way or the other on the military field, there doesn't appear to be any way that they will, either side will compromise what are their goals. please note, in the Western press, President Putin has maximalist goals of recovering yet more of Ukraine for Russia, in the sense of he wants, ideally, all of Ukraine to be back in the Russian Empire. However, so has Ukraine got maximalist demands, in the sense it's not prepared to let go of any of its conquered territory, illegally speaking. And so, therefore, it's quite hard to see anything working. No ceasefire can be signed because President Putin's Russia loses out on this. What can happen is minor stuff, an exchange of prisoners, perhaps something else they can think of, which won't actually change the situation, but at least give some impression of some movement.
And are we any clearer on what security guarantees the US is offering Ukraine, if at all? I mean, Ukraine seems to want an awful lot of things from the Americans.
Yeah, because they've realized quite correctly that America's the one that can guarantee security. For all the talk of Europe and sending boots on the ground there, they're very small forces and they're not all that well equipped. And so therefore this is irrelevant. He wants, quite rightly, guarantees from America. The central problem is, America's unwilling to give them, because essentially Donald Trump doesn't want to get involved and certainly doesn't want the cost, and it's not even clear he wants to guard against Russia. He would like to work with Russia. Russia has recently offered $12 trillion worth of business, which is a substantial amount, of course. And so therefore, the guarantees are likely to be vague and woolly, which is precisely what President Zelensky does not want, and is pressing for more concrete guarantees. But nothing has come forth that we know of. And so what is likely is that although the Americans have said in principle they're prepared to do something, in practice, they have not actually signed up to anything. And worst of all, please remember, there were guarantees for Ukraine by America and Great Britain in 1994 when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. And they're absolutely useless, they were too.
So in that regard, would it be fair to say that Donald Trump wants this war to end, and he doesn't seem to mind on what terms it would end?
Yes, I think it's quite clear that he would accept a loss of Ukrainian territory without a qualm. He could then get rid of all these sanctions, which he's not really keen on, and start doing business, which he really likes. And that is, in fact, his goal. For Ukraine, of course, this will be a very bitter pill to swallow, that after 4 years of fighting, to have to give up any territory at all legally, when in fact they have not been defeated in the correct sense of the term. However, in terms of history, this is quite usual. If you like, in the wars between Russia and Poland, for example, compromises were reached, and there's no obvious reason why some sort of compromise couldn't be reached here. But that's not what President Donald Trump is saying. He's really saying Ukraine must give up land, which the Ukrainians do not want to do. But from his point of view, yes, and therefore, yes, he doesn't really mind about that. It would mean peace and business, which is what he wants.
Well, let's just drill down a bit further on that before we let you go, Dr. Laskiewicz. Volodymyr Zelensky said in his speech today that Ukraine will do everything to achieve peace. The Americans are saying, give up the Donbass, give Russia that parcel of land that it wants, and the war can end. Why is it so important to Ukraine that it doesn't give up that territory that Russia has failed to win on the battlefield? I mean, is there fear that Russia is trying to make Ukraine a subjugated state, or some other thing?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, actually. First of all, you ought to divide the conquered territory into two, the ones that Russia wants, or three, strictly speaking. This territory which it has conquered, Ukraine doesn't want to give up, and that, I think, is the key sticking point. As for the rest of the territory in the Donbass, that indeed is an interesting one. Why Ukraine should want to give it up, we'd be prepared to, because as you pointed out quite correctly, it would be a launch pad for a real strike on Kiev, which is, if you like, the third possibility, that Russia could still capture Ukraine. It still is not impossible. And therefore, what we're doing here is Ukraine, quite rightly, is not prepared to give up the Donbass region, which Russia hasn't conquered. There are also some defensive lines there, by the way, just to add to it. However, as for the conquered territory by Russia, that is the more interesting one. Ukraine simply doesn't want to give it up. The alternative, if I go back to the Poland-Russian war, or various ones, is that Poland was at times prepared to give up territory and then thought did achieve peace. So we must really say that President Zelenskyy wants peace on his terms, which is precisely what President Putin wants, peace on his terms. And therefore there's no difference. Hence the lack of dialogue. Hence, if we like, that although people go on about peace, a just peace, whatever that means, because it did involve at one point President Zelenskyy wanting to put President Putin on war crimes trials. And so therefore, and please note, the issue of reparations for damage caused by Russia during this war is yet another thorny aspect yet to be fully answered. And in fact, the whole business of the $300 billion of Russian assets, which have been temporarily frozen, the fact of the matter is neither side is prepared to want peace on any terms but its own, which could be called on both sides maximalist.
Thank you, Dr. Laskiewicz. We hugely appreciate your assessment. Dr. Marek Laskiewicz is the author and international affairs analyst who's talking to me on the line from London.